Welcome to today's webinar brought to you by OraSure Technologies Incorporated. OraSure Technologies is a global leader in oral fluid substance abuse testing products. Their unique assays provide accurate and easy-to-administer testing methods to help determine the presence or absence of drugs or alcohol in a person's system. Oral fluid-based testing products provide a simplified collection process, faster results, cost savings with minimal risk of tampering, and dramatically reduced risk of adulteration. The Intercept Oral Fluid Drug Test is an FDA-cleared laboratory-based oral fluid drug testing system that enables accurate testing for drugs of abuse, including marijuana, cocaine, PCP, amphetamines, and opiates. With a fast and easy-to-administer collection process, Intercept is ideal for workplace, criminal justice, drug treatment centers, and clinical setting screening programs, among others. Also hosting with us today is OcuScreen. They are an employment screening firm who partner with organizations nationwide to assist with confident hiring by providing timely and reliable criminal background and drug screening results at competitive pricing. With more than 20 years of industry experience, employers can expect the highest level of screening and technology available, along with individually customizing services to meet the needs of businesses of all sizes. Today's presentation is approved for 1 credit hour of continuing education for CSAPAs and BDAPAs from SAPAC. Further information will be provided at the end of our presentation. Today's presentation is entitled, Your Best Employee Has a Positive Drug Test, Now What? And will be presented by Bill Curran and Sharon Jutila. Bill Curran is the president and founder of WFC & Associates, a national consulting firm that specializes in drug testing policy development and providing accurate and up-to-date state drug testing law information. He is the editor of the online Ultimate Guide to State Drug Testing Laws at statedrugtestinglaws.com and the publisher of the e-newsletter State Drug Testing Laws Monthly and the weekly e-news service Drug Testing in the News. He is the author or co-author of 10 books on substance abuse issues. He also administers the annual Drug Testing Industry Survey, now in its 15th year. Sharon Jutila is an attorney and human resource expert with over 15 years of experience providing advice and recommendations to a wide range of businesses. During her career, Sharon has handled all matters related to labor and employment, including hiring, discipline, termination, discrimination, and harassment prevention, wage and hour, employee leaves, return to work, and union issues. She is knowledgeable on ADA, ADEA, Title VII, FLSA, FMLA, IRCA, NLRA, OSHA, and state laws. She is a well-respected trainer and has presented trainings on human resource and employment compliance issues at over 100 conferences. In addition, she is a trained mediator who has experience resolving disputes between parties over the span of her career. Sharon has assisted dozens of clients spanning the range from high-tech semiconductor companies to roofing and stucco companies. With us today from OcuScreen is Pamela Mack. I will now turn the mic over to Pamela, and then we will hear from Bill and Sharon.
Good morning and afternoon, depending where you are. I just wanted to let you know that the inspiration for this topic came from our role at OcuScreen as a third-party administrator for drug and background screening programs. What we found is that our clients are confident in using a drug screening program to help them support a drug-free workplace. But the reality of a valued employee failing a drug test could sometimes create an awkward situation. And when this occurred, what happened is that people were looking for options besides termination and often wanted to retest the employee in hopes of maybe just avoiding that situation entirely. So our goal today is to give employers the confidence that they need to trust the drug screen results rather than considering a retest, which is usually going to be expensive and often unnecessary, and then provide some options for protocols so that when the situation does arise, the employer can be comfortable with the plan that they have already put into place. And now I'm going to turn this over to Bill Curran to get started.
Pam, thank you very much, and thanks to OraSure and OcuScreen for co-hosting today's webinar. I'm really looking forward to this subject today, too. We're going to talk a little bit about laboratory-based oral fluid testing and then the second half will be Sharon's part on what to do when somebody tests positive. And as lab-based oral fluid testing becomes more and more prominent and popular, that's a very legitimate question, especially as companies make the switch from a traditional lab-based urine testing program to oral fluid. What do? How do you treat those situations? Do you treat them the same? Do you have some flexibility? Sharon's going to get into all of those issues. Now, one of the things that Jessica mentioned at the outset is that at WFC and Associates, we do an annual survey of the drug testing industry. And anyone on the line who's in the drug testing business, if you're interested in being a participant in this year's survey, just send me your email afterwards using my contact information, bill@billcurrent.com, and I would be happy to include you in the survey this year. This is a little bit of what we've been hearing over the last couple of years from people regarding oral fluid testing. A lot of providers are seeing an increase in interest. They're selling more lab-based oral fluid testing. It's really sort of been building up for a while, as you can see from the quotes here. Some companies actually looking for ways to combine oral fluid testing with urine testing or oral fluid testing with hair testing, merging those technologies together to sort of get the most out of drug testing. And the big question is, why so much interest? Well, a lot of it has to do with the technology, of course, but not too many years ago, just a couple of years ago, the Drug Testing Advisory Board issued a report to SAMHSA, Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, recommending that they add lab-based oral fluid testing to the federal regulations for drug testing, and they accepted that recommendation, and now, for the last many months now, they've been in the process of writing the first draft of those regulations. Well, they're not out yet, so they're not part of the SAMHSA guidelines. DOT, which has already signaled that they're going to adopt lab-based oral fluid testing, still hasn't done it because the guidelines aren't out. But what's happening is that a lot of people are hearing about lab-based oral fluid testing, and as a result, there's a growing interest in lab-based oral fluid testing. And so, hence the comments that just read from the previous last couple of years of our industry survey. Which kind of companies are interested in lab-based oral fluid testing? Well, companies that have not done drug testing in the past, because perhaps lab-based or POCT urine testing simply did not meet their needs for any variety of reasons. Just high turnover, where getting people through a typical urine collection process just doesn't make sense. Any number of reasons. Companies that have not done drug testing in the past may very well be interested in doing drug testing if there was a method available that met their needs. Of course, with the economy the way it is, there are a lot of companies today that must justify the expense of everything in their budget. And so the maintaining of a drug testing program falls into one of those categories. And there are always people within companies that are thinking, well, we can do away with drug testing, right? Well, of course, the cost of not having a drug testing program typically far outweighs whatever price you're paying for your drug testing from year to year. So companies that are trying to justify every expense may be interested in a testing method that in many ways is much more economical and has a much more attractive return on investment in some ways than some traditional drug testing methods. And then, of course, there are those companies where the use of conventional off-site collection services is just impractical. Maybe they're 24-hour shifts, weekend shifts. They have safety-sensitive workplaces where people are getting injured at 2 o'clock in the morning, and what's it cost to bring somebody on site to do that? In a lot of situations where urine testing is considered to be, by the employer, the method they prefer, the cost of that 2 a.m. on-site collection is worth it to them. And there's no reason to argue against that, because it's not a question of which testing method is the best. It's which testing method is best for you. And so a lot of companies will come to that conclusion, and they'll want to pay that extra cost to have that type of test, a test that today would mirror, say, the U.S. Department of Transportation regulations, which right now are limited to lab-based urine testing. In the future, that will change. But right now, they want a program that mirrors the DOT regs or the SAMHSA guidelines, 49 CFR Part 40, that type of thing. That's fine, of course. But for other companies, that conventional off-site collection services routine just does not meet their needs for a number of reasons. And so those are companies that would be considered, that would be interested in looking at alternatives like lab-based oral fluid testing. We have found from our research, and this is what people in the industry, the drug testing industry, are telling us, is that the industries that are showing the most interest in lab-based oral fluid testing are, as you see from the list, retail, construction, manufacturing, et cetera. But also it's important to note, especially if you're in the drug testing business, that there are markets for drug testing, of course, outside of the workplace. And many of those markets have traditionally looked at and used alternative testing methods, like point of collection testing, of course, but also alternative specimen testing, like hair testing, or in a growing number of cases, oral fluid testing. That could be in the criminal justice, the law enforcement markets, drug courts, family courts, things of that nature, and of course, schools. So it's not just the workplace market, but other markets as well that may have an interest in some cases have traditionally used oral fluid testing. And there are a lot of advantages to oral fluid testing. We're not going to spend a lot of time on this. You're going to have access to these slides, so we don't have to go through each one of these bullet issues. But it's important to note that oral fluid testing in general is virtually impossible to cheat on. It's almost adulteration proof. And I say almost because there's always somebody out there that claims that they can cheat on any kind of a drug test. Well, we know that there's a lot of cheating going on with traditional urine testing programs. We put a lot of safeguards in place to try to fight against that. But with oral fluid testing, there's just not a lot out there. It's legal in almost every state, and it's legally defensible. The thing that people really like about oral fluid testing is the collection process. It really doesn't have to require a professional technician. And I know that people in the drug testing business sort of cringe at that, but let me just say this. If you're talking to a client that is determined to switch to oral fluid testing, you need to be the source of the good information about it, because if you try to resist that and you try to talk them out of it, if they're determined to do it, that's just a client that you're going to lose. And so even though you may be losing the collection revenue from using collection sites, you're going to keep the client, and that, in the end, is the bottom line. And so collections are one of those things that make oral fluid testing one of the methods that fits into certain situations where a traditional urine test, whether it's POCT or in most cases lab-based urine testing, where it just doesn't work. Oral fluid collections are always observable, 100%. The donor, the administrator, always within view of one another. The collection process is very simple. And a lot of people kind of don't like urine because they consider it yucky. That goes away with saliva as well. So there are a number of benefits or advantages to oral fluid testing that just resonate. They just resonate with employers and other potential buyers that have just sort of shied away. I spent a little bit of time on cheating already. I'll just say that I've done a little bit of research on this. I've done webinars on cheating on drug tests, and it can be quite humorous to hear the different ways that people try to cheat on a urine test and sneaking substitute urine into the bathroom stall and all kinds of things like that. But the truth of the matter is, if you go online looking for advice on how to cheat on an oral fluid test, most of the time you're going to hear something like this. Try to avoid the test. Avoid submitting your saliva. Between these periods of time, you must avoid being screened or you will surely test positive. That's stuff that's out there from people who are in the business of helping other people cheat on drug tests. Avoid the test if you can, because we don't really have a good solution for you when it comes to cheating on a saliva or an oral fluid test. So that's really one of the big advantages. Now, as many of you on the line know, we have a website called statedrugtestinglaws.com. We spend hours and hours every day tracking state drug testing laws. And one of the things that I hear every now and then still, used to hear it a lot in the past, still hear it occasionally now, is that oral fluid testing is illegal in every state. And I scratch my head and I think, how can anybody think that? For one thing, drug testing is legal in every state, but oral fluid testing is legal in virtually every state. Now, I still put Maine, Vermont, and Hawaii among the 50 states, plus the territory of Puerto Rico. I still put them in the red. Now, I will get arguments occasionally from somebody in one of those states that says, we're doing oral fluid testing in Maine, we're doing it in Vermont. And that's fine, of course. But going by what's in the regulations for those states, I list those 3 states as not necessarily prohibiting oral fluid overtly, but by not allowing it, by talking about what they do allow and including everything but oral fluid testing. So there are a number of states where it's a little bit in the gray area, but I consider Maine, Vermont, and Hawaii as the only states that really don't allow oral fluid testing. unless you're talking about the states that have voluntary drug testing laws. As you know, there are states with mandatory laws like Maine and Vermont and Hawaii, but there are many states that have voluntary drug testing laws. I know that sounds like an oxymoron, a voluntary law, but the truth of the matter is there are states like here in Florida where I live and work where an employer can voluntarily choose to apply to get into a program, follow the drug testing guidelines of that program, and qualify for a 5% discount in their workers' compensation premiums. That's fantastic for companies that can get into that program. There are some limitations. For companies that can't get into the program or for whatever reason don't want to participate in the program, the voluntary law requirements don't apply to them. They only apply to companies that are participating in the quote-unquote voluntary program. And there are a number of states around the country that have voluntary laws. These are the states in red that have voluntary laws but only allow urine or hair testing. They don't allow oral fluid testing. I will still get arguments on some of these states too, especially on Ohio, which used to allow oral fluid testing. A few years ago, they revamped their workers' comp discount program entirely, and when they did, they inserted into the voluntary law language a requirement that drug testing programs mirror the federal regulations. And so based on that, oral fluid testing wouldn't be allowed as part of that discount program in Ohio. That will change, of course, you would think, right? When the feds allow lab-based oral fluid testing, Ohio would, by default, allow lab-based oral fluid testing as well as part of the as part of the voluntary program. Let me say, though, that, again, outside of the voluntary program in Ohio, there is no mandatory statewide drug testing law that specifically says what type of specimen you can use and which ones you can't use. And so outside of the voluntary law in Ohio, as well as in these other states, there is no limitation. Now, some of the states on the list offer a safe harbor type of protection, limited liability protection when an employer acts in good faith based on the result of a drug test if they drug test in accordance with guidelines provided by the state. And other states like Florida, like Ohio, like Tennessee, they offer that 5% discount. In some states like Georgia, it's a little bit higher. Ohio actually has a two-tier program. One of the tiers is a little higher. But the thing I want to emphasize here with this chart is these are voluntary laws. And so in essence, it's really the states that we showed here in the previous slide, Maine, Vermont, and Hawaii, that have mandatory drug testing laws. And in these other states with the voluntary laws, you can see the map is still pretty much blue, meaning in these states you can use oral fluid testing. Okay? So that's the kind of the skinny on state drug testing laws. I know there's some people out there saying, what about POCT oral fluid? Well, we're really not presenting on that today, but I will say that there are states that do not allow point-of-collection testing, period, like Kansas, like Minnesota, like Vermont. And so whether it was urine or whether it was oral fluid, you wouldn't be able to use the device, the oral fluid POCT device, in those states. I put Nevada and New York on the list also because, while it's not technically prohibited in those two states, they make it very, very challenging for a typical employer to actually do point-of-collection testing. And so it's not against the law in Nevada and New York, but it's very, very difficult to qualify to do it. Okay. If you're interested, if you're in the process of developing or setting up a lab-based oral fluid testing, of course, the first step after you've made the decision to go in that direction is revise your policy to reflect your new testing technology, in this case, lab-based oral fluid testing. I might add as well that you might want to consider saliva alcohol testing using something like the QED device, which is allowed under the federal regulations, okay, and is a nice complement to a lab-based oral fluid testing program. List the drugs you're going to test for and the cutoff levels. Explain how collections will take place, right? It's going to be different than your old urine testing program. But make sure that you emphasize the fact that this is a lab-based testing program. You're still going to get a laboratory result. You're not asking supervisors and managers administering the test or administering the collection, overseeing it, to actually read a device and try to determine whether it's positive or negative. The specimen is still going to go to the laboratory, and it's going to be tested in a laboratory. And so if there's an initial screen positive and non-negative, that confirmation test can take place because the specimen's there ready to go. An MRO can review it and verify the result, and then you're going to want to make sure you're following results reporting laws that apply in the states where you do business. just like you would with any other testing program. You're going to need to train the supervisors. They're going to need to know how to do the program. They may be even the ones you want to train to oversee the collection process and ship the specimens at the end of the day or during the day to a laboratory. But they need to be brought into the process, okay, as you make that switch. Make sure your laboratory is prepared. Obviously, you're switching to oral fluid testing. You need that confirmation process. You need to let your MRO know, of course, that you're switching to oral fluid testing. That's a very important process. And I always tell people, just don't take anything for granted. Assume nothing. Estimate the number of drug tests that you're going to conduct over a period of time. Make sure you've got enough product on hand, enough chain of custody forms in place, and always be anticipating your needs. This is good advice no matter what, but certainly applicable when you're making a switch over to a different and a new testing technology. And then I always tell people the rollout is very important. As you start to work with your employees, make sure they understand what this new program will do. And in some states, make sure that you give them enough notice. I've just put a few examples on this particular slide, but you can see where Maine requires 30 days advance notice for new policies and 60 days for changes to an existing policy. So if you're a company or you're working with a client that already has a policy, they're switching from urine to oral fluid, that would probably fall under the 60-day advance notice requirement in the state of Maine. There are other requirements depending on the state, okay? Several of the states with voluntary laws also have advance notice requirements when introducing a policy or making changes to an existing policy. And when you do the rollout, do in-person training sessions focusing on how oral fluid testing works. A lot of the common myths and misconceptions about oral fluid testing are out there, and as soon as you announce that you're switching to oral fluid testing, your employees are going to go online and start looking for information about it, especially the ones who are the drug users perhaps. But there's a lot of good corresponding truths to offset those myths. Make sure you understand what they are, and you're prepared to discuss those with your employees as you begin to roll out your program, letting them know that oral fluid testing is accurate, it's legal where we do business, and we think it's going to work for our company. Let me give you just a couple of examples. Under accuracy, let them know that you're using an FDA-cleared device and laboratory testing system. I think that's crucial. In today's world, with the technology advances that we have for drug testing, there's never an issue about having to deal with a non-FDA-cleared laboratory oral fluid testing program. It's just not necessary. That's something your employees will want to know, okay? And the process that you went through to make sure that you're working with a product and with a provider that are legitimate, that the integrity of your testing program's in place. You even tested the package insert, for example, and you put that device to the test, and you've learned from a pilot program, perhaps, that this program works and that's why we're doing it. Let them know the window of detection. That's one of the greatest myths, is that the oral fluid detection or window of detection is so short it doesn't catch drug users. The truth of the matter is, as you can see to the far left there, it mimics blood in terms of window of detection. In other words, it detects or is capable of detecting the presence of drug in the oral fluid sample almost immediately after the person ingests the drug. That's different than urine, which takes about an hour for that window of detection to open up. Of course, the window of detection is going to go farther out with urine, but when you consider reasonable suspicion in post-accident testing and needing to know at that moment whether a person has drugs in their system, that oral fluid testing is going to catch a lot of people that maybe you would miss with other testing methods, certainly with hair, but even with urine, to the point where the overlap is pretty standard. You'll find that the positivity rates from drug to drug with oral fluid testing, the middle column is the Intercept lab-based oral fluid testing statistics, compared to urinalysis is almost identical, 4.1 to 4.4, but scan down to the fourth drug on the list, THC, marijuana. That's one of the things that people will read about on the internet and get a lot of misinformation. The positivity rate with oral fluid testing and THC, when you're talking about lab-based oral fluid testing, is pretty good. In fact, in this study, the positivity rate was slightly higher. And you can see that a lot depends on the cutoff level. The vast majority of positives for THC is going to be to the left of that dotted vertical line, which means it's the lower cutoff levels. Anything over 50%, not much chance you're going to catch or detect the presence of THC. but the vast majority of them are going to be down there at the 20 and less than 20. You can see most of it's right there around 10 nanograms per milliliter. This is information that you can share with your workers so that they have a sense of comfort that the program that you've just introduced is really going to still work, okay? Now, to make sure Sharon has enough time, I'm just going to scan through these real quickly, but when you get these slides, you'll be able to go through these return on investment slides and compare one testing method, oral fluid versus lab-based urine, and look at the cost of the test and the cost of the time that it takes to do the test. And you can see that a lab-based urine test, when you add the cost of lost work time to the equation, can be quite expensive. And in some workplace situations, that can be an unacceptable cost. And so on the far right, you see the total cost with lost work time for lab-based oral fluid testing, and the price comes down considerably. Okay. Now, what do you do when somebody tests positive? I'm really excited for the next half of our presentation from Sharon Judula, and I'm going to turn the microphone, so to speak, over to her.
Great. Thank you for joining us today. Thanks for all that great information, Bill. I really appreciate it because it gives me a chance to refresh my knowledge, too. I am a human resources consultant with a company called AmeriBen that helps employers throughout the U.S. with human resources issues that are a little bit different than what we normally see in the workplace. Oh, here we go. Normally, we're called in when we get issues that are really talking about we've had an issue and failed a drug test, so now what's happening? So really the things I'm going to cover you can see on the screen, and one of the things we're going to talk about most is retesting and last chance agreements and how you can work with those once you do have a positive drug test, especially when you're using a lab-based results test like the Intercept. So benefits of a third-party administrator. The reasons that we talk about this, and obviously we partner heavily with OcuScreen as an administrator, is that they really are experts in the field. Much like Bill is an expert in drug testing all across the U.S., third-party administrators really become experts in their area and keep up to date on information such as lab-based oral fluids testing and when the regulations are going to be passing and whether you can use them for DOT screening or post-accident if you have drivers who are certified. So that is one important reason that I always think of a third-party administrator being crucial to any drug testing policy. Also, we often find that most employers don't understand that random truly does mean random. Most third-party administrators have programs that pick randomization based on a logarithm, which means everybody can be chosen on every single random testing. I know that Pam gets questions routinely on, can we make sure the people that just got tested in our random testing aren't included in the next random testing? Well, if we did that, it wouldn't be random testing. So that's one area where a third-party administrator really does become crucial, is they make sure that the programs that you're using are as legally defensible as possible. We also find that clients ask both us and OcuScreen, so can we schedule our random testing on the 1st of every month? Well, that's not really random either because then all your employees know what's coming up. So a third-party administrator will help you set up a calendar that's truly random so that your employees don't know when the next testing is going to be coming up. And then I have down here plausible deniability for all of those that have watched Independence Day since we just got past our 4th of July holiday. But what I mean by that is a lot of employers are still hesitant with their drug testing policies. When it comes to having the conversations with the employee that says, I'm sorry, but you've tested positive, it's a very emotional conversation for some employers. So if you have a third-party administrator that is helping administer your drug testing policy and is actually doing the testing, providing the results, and being a backup resource for you, you as an employer can honestly say to them, listen, we have a third-party administrator do all of our testing. These are the results that come back. It's a lab-based testing. They're the experts in the area, and they're the ones that are telling us that you've tested positive. So this is not an issue of us making this decision. This is an issue of the third-party administrator saying on your drug test you tested positive or non-negative. So that is what I mean by plausible deniability. It does help some employers prep for those difficult conversations where they have to sit down with employees and tell them that there's consequences to a drug test that they actually have administered. One of the things that is really important for you to look at when you're looking at drug testing, whether we're talking about before testing, during testing, or after a positive result, is what does your policy say? It's so important that you actually follow your own policy. Like Bill was saying, if you're going to start using oral, lab-based oral fluids testing, you need to revise your policy to say that. So really you have to look at what your policy says. When we're talking about pre-employment, what your policy should say is that you have the complete discretion not to hire. And from both a third-party administrator view and a human resources consultant view, we really see that when a person has a positive pre-employment test, your best course of action is just not to hire that individual. That can be difficult if it's someone that's been referred or otherwise, but if you vary from that, you are actually asking for problems discrimination-wise that we'll talk about next. We've also talked a little bit as third-party administrators with OccuScreen about the fact that there's really not a need for an adverse action letter under the Fair Credit Reporting Act. But you should always let your applicants know the reason that you're not hiring them. So generally, depending on how many applicants and how many folks you're testing on a daily, weekly, monthly basis, a lot of our employers just call and say, I'm sorry, but you haven't passed our drug screening. And then follow that up with a form letter that says, thank you for applying, but you haven't met our hiring criteria. Now, as far as retesting for pre-employment, this is a question that Pam at OccuScreen gets all the time as a third-party administrator. So we have an employee we really, really want to hire, but they failed their drug screen. So now we want to retest them. So you really need to think about whether or not you're going to allow reapplication and retesting within a specified time frame. And if you're going to do that, I would suggest that you have that written in your policy if possible. So if you have a candidate that fails their drug screen, and you have a 90-day window so they can reapply and be retested within a 90-day time frame, and that previous drug test will not be considered in their new application process. We find this a lot, that employers call and say, we really want to hire this person, but now we don't know what to do. They just failed the drug test. So it's best if you address that up front in your policy, so when those situations come up, you do know how to deal with it. And remember, if you're doing pre-employment drug testing, you need to be testing everyone. So if you test one applicant, you need to be testing all your applicants in order to avoid any claims of discrimination. The next thing you need to look at is for your post-accident testing. So really, you absolutely, under post-accident testing, have to treat everyone the same, no exceptions. So if your policy says that you're going to test post-accident, that means everybody post-accident. And this is one area where the lab-based oral results are really great, particularly hopefully once DOT has those codified into the regulations that they can be used. Because obviously post-accident testing on site, you're going to get a quicker result as to what is immediately in that bloodstream, as Bill was saying, than sending them to a urine-based testing where it might be considerable, they might not, they may have had the accident and be tested within the hour and something might not show up. You also need to think about when you're doing post-accident testing, whether you want to set a limit. Are you going to set a limit on the amount of damage dollar-wise, or whether there was someone injured? And that's when you're going to do post-accident testing. Or anytime there's an accident in the workplace, are you going to do testing? It's really important to clarify in your policy how that is going to work out so your employees are clear as to when that post-accident testing will take place. And then random testing, like we've obviously talked about, is using a logarithm to avoid liability. Random testing isn't just merely throwing all your employees' names in a hat and pulling them out, or, doing the first half of the alphabet. You really do need that third-party administrator or a verified type of program to do the random testing. And if you're going to do random testing, you need to be aware that this is the times where we find a lot that employee that you are dreading failing a drug test shows up as a positive. Because in the random testing, you never know who's going to be pulled. And honestly, you never know who's going to test positive. So be prepared, just like with reasonable suspicion. If you have an employee that your policy says you have reasonable suspicion and you're going to test, you need to be prepared when you do that test for the consequences of them failing it. And then what are you going to do at that point? So when we're looking at testing, the first place we always go is really look at your policy to see when you're going to test, who you're going to test, and how you're going to test. And the most important thing is to cover those contingencies. And if you're going to change the method of testing, as Bill says, make sure you revise your policy to include that and provide the proper notices under all of the different state regulations that you need to think about in your own particular state. So now you've had someone fail. You've been notified that you have had an employee you sent either for post-accident or random testing fail. What do you do now? First off, you have to follow your own policy. So that's why we talked about policy first. You need to immediately pull out your drug testing policy and review it. Preferably, you'll be talking with your third-party administrator because they'll know what your testing is, but you have to follow your own policy. That's why you have a written policy. That's why it's there. Now, most policies are either going to be zero tolerance, which says if anyone comes back as a positive test, you are going to be terminated. So it's a zero tolerance drug and alcohol policy. Anyone who tests positive will be terminated, and if it's an applicant, you will not hire them. Or, which is the other alternative we see most often, the policy is really silent on the consequences of a positive test, except to say that there will be discipline up to and including termination. So when you have something that says up to and including termination, that opens the door for you to decide what you're going to do with that particular employee. There's really two ways you can go about it. You can really do a termination. You either have a zero tolerance policy, so everybody's going to be terminated, or you have a subpar employee. So you have an employee that's just mediocre or okay. They're not fantastic. They're not a complete failure, but they're not a superstar either. So in those situations, you may get the positive test and decide this is a situation where we're going to say your discipline is going to be termination. Or you have an employee that's had other disciplinary issues. They've had performance issues that they've been wrote up for. They've had insubordination issues. Maybe they violated other policies of yours that haven't been egregious enough to warrant termination, but they've been egregious enough to have written disciplinary actions. So really what we need to think about is who exactly is failing the testing and what you're going to do about it. Now, when your best employee fails that drug test, really what we're talking about then is last chance agreements. So last chance agreements really are talking about if you're in a situation where you have an employee that tested positive and you want to provide them with another opportunity, what can we do about that? I would highly recommend that you have something about last chance agreements included in your policy itself, that when circumstances warrant it, you may offer a last chance agreement to an employee, but you're going to take a look and see under which circumstances those are going to be. Now, most last chance agreements routinely include a treatment program where the employee is going to need to go through a treatment program of some sort. either paid by the employer if you're an extremely generous employer, or you're going to be, under insurance or their own dime, that they have regular mandated testing at some point in time. And then they also have random testing. So they may be tested monthly or weekly, and in addition, they may be tested randomly. So this would be a perfect opportunity for the lab-based oral results fluid because as you can see with the last chance agreement, you may have multiple testing within a 6 or 9 month period, however long that regular mandated testing is going to actually be. So when you terminate, Pam talked a lot about difficult conversations on how you need to make sure that you're ready for that difficult conversation. So if you test, you need to be prepared to terminate. The policy says that you're going to take disciplinary action, and you need to be prepared as the individual who's going to have to sit down and say, I'm sorry, you failed your drug test, we no longer can have you employed. Now, the perfect thing is with a third-party administrator, what you can tell that employee is your initial screening was positive, and then your split specimen was also tested, and it was confirmed positive, and that the positive has been verified. So if your policy calls for a medical review officer to actually take a look at those and talk to positive, or however your policy is going to lay out, that's what you can be prepared for when you have that conversation. You have in your arsenal of issues to state is that we have a policy, we test on it, you were chosen for testing, our third-party administrator has provided us the results, you had an initial positive result, that initial positive result was then confirmed by a different laboratory analysis, and we now have a verified positive. So under these circumstances, we've determined that we have no, recourse except to terminate your employment effective immediately. So if you're going to be testing, you really need to be prepared to terminate, because I will strongly tell you that I don't think you should retest employees who have had a verified positive, unless, and I always say the standard, unless your state law requires otherwise. You should always obviously check state law on that to find out whether either under a voluntary safe harbor type of program or one of the programs that Phil was talking about where you get a discount on your workers' compensation or other premiums if retesting is mandatory. Obviously, your third-party administrator can help you with that also. So really what you need to think about is why you shouldn't retest. Really, the test was positive twice. The initial test was positive, the retest was positive. It's not in conformance with your own policy because most employers' policies don't allow for retest. It really does undermine your own policy because if you're going to test and then retest everyone again, if you look at that blood analysis and the oral analysis, some of those issues dissipate in hours and days, not necessarily weeks. So by the time you've got a confirmed result back and then you retest, you may have issues that have gone out of the system. So that's really important when you're thinking about post-accident testing. And then it really does open the door to discrimination claims because how are you going to decide who to retest? Are you going to retest someone because you like them? Are you going to retest someone because they're, the really valuable positive employee? Everybody is a protected classification. So when you start determining who to retest, if you're going to retest one individual, you almost open the door to having to retest all of your positives. That's why we really advocate last chance agreements. But those are our legal contracts between employers and employees. So if your very best employee tests positive, you can offer them the last chance agreement. And there's a lot of different issues that you can look at, but what we're really going to talk about is your valuable employees, tenured, they may have personal circumstances, or the employee self-identifies. So let's talk a little bit via example of our two employees who failed the same day. So we have Sally Slacker, who is a 45-year-old Hispanic female who's worked with your company for less than a year, and her 6-month performance evaluation was less than stellar and had some needs improvement. And in the meantime, she's gotten some warnings for being late and failing to complete her projects on time. Then you have Wally Wonderful, who was picked on the same random testing. He's 35 years old. He's a white male who's been with your company since he started working at the age of 16, and he's grown up with the company, got his college degree, and now is your most successful salesperson or accountant or insert, your department here. So you have two disparately different individuals. You now have a choice. What are you going to do with them? Obviously, Sally Slacker, you probably don't feel like giving another opportunity. If she has a positive test, she's probably going to be someone that you want to say, I'm sorry, you're terminated. Wally Wonderful, this is going to be a big deal for your company to lose him. So what you really look at then is discrimination issues. Both of them obviously have protected classifications on both sides of the fence. But what you need to look at is the individual circumstances. So you're going to look at their previous performance, their tenure with the company, the value to the company. Obviously I stacked our deck in terms of Wally Wonderful, but those are the issues that it comes down to. What are the major differences between these two employees that would cause you to want to treat them differently without regard to race, religion, gender, and all of our protected classifications? So it usually comes down to the issues that I've listed there. Now, I'm going to tell you, anytime you have these issues come up, you need to call your attorney, particularly when you're talking about last chance agreements, anytime you want to treat failing employees differently, anytime you want to deviate from your written policy, or anytime an employee self-identifies. This is going to come up when you announce a random test and you have an employee pulled for a random who, before they even go to testing, comes to you and says, I'm going to test positive. So then what are you going to do in that circumstance, particularly if they're Wally Wonderful? So that's really when you need to talk about, talking to an attorney to work through those issues. So really your best practices are going to be review your policy annually, particularly if you need to add things like the lab-based oral fluids testing. Follow your own policy. I strongly recommend a third-party administrator for all of the reasons that I talked about. They can be the fall guy a lot of times because they're the professional in this area. I would strongly recommend not allowing retests unless your state law requires it. Don't hire your applicants who fail, and make sure you decide whether you're going to allow them to retest or not. And then really do use your last chance agreement sparingly. These should honestly be for the best and the brightest of your company who, if they left, you would have a significant hole in your productivity and your profitability. So really now I am going to hand the ball back over to Bill so that we can open up for any questions that he may have received while we've been talking.
Thank you. That was excellent, Sharon. Thank you so much. That was a perfect follow-up to the whole introduction of oral fluid testing in the workplace. We've had a number of questions come in, and I've asked Pam Mack if she would join us for the Q&A because a couple of the questions are really in her backyard. So I'm going to address this first one to Pam. Pam, the question was on the price of oral fluid testing. Now, I know you can't quote prices over the phone, but would you consider them to be, generally in the ballpark of traditional testing? And then a second question that was directed toward you was, in your opinion, from your experience working with companies that do lab-based oral fluid testing, how accurate is it from a real-world, day-to-day perspective?
So, sure, I can answer those. First of all, with the pricing, I'm going to say that it is very much in line with urine drug testing if you're not paying collection fees. If you're paying collection fees on top of your analysis, it's probably going to be cheaper for you to do the oral fluids testing just because you aren't paying that collection fee. If you are paying for the collection device and the laboratory analysis, those two things together usually come out to about the same as you would be paying for a urine test analysis without the collection fee. So I think the pricing is actually pretty similar, and then, of course, as Bill mentioned, it's less if you include time spent on taking the drug test. As far as the accuracy and the people we've worked with, we have a lot of clients that are using it for a post-accident or a cause situation, and we've been very happy with the results. Because it does go through confirmation and is lab-based, we don't have any concerns about whether or not the accuracy level is okay. As long as you've trained your manager or whoever's doing the testing, which is extremely simple, as long as you're confident with them that they can fill out the chain of custody form, witness the collection, which the applicant actually administers to themselves, I don't have any trouble with that at all.
Okay.
Okay.
Sharon, here's a question for you. You talked about, how to treat employees, differently under different circumstances, or whether or not to consider that. And a question was asked about companies that have both DOT and non-DOT workers, testing obviously under their DOT policy, those, say, drivers, for example, but also having employees that are not under the DOT policy where there's a separate company policy. How do you address that from a, somebody just tested positive and deciding how to treat that situation?
Obviously, those are going to be very different situations because if we're talking about DOT testing, it's heavily regulated in what you have to do when employees test positive. So first off, I would see them as almost two separate classes of employees, which are going to be your DOT regulated employees who have their DOT approved drug screening policy, and then your regular employees who you're going to have your other drug screening policy for that's either compliant with a voluntary or mandatory state law or just in general a best practices law. So you're really going to have to treat those two classes, if you will, differently because your regulated employees under DOT, there's specific things that you have to do, including when you test, terminate, all of those type of things, when you can't let them drive, versus your non-DOT regulated employees who, as an employer, you have much more control over, including decisions on when to terminate, when to use last chance agreements, and those type of things. So you really need to think of them as two individual classes of employees with very separate policies. So you treat DOT employees equally under their policy, and you treat your non-DOT employees equally under their policy. But think of them as separate.
Okay. And here's kind of a related question that came in from one of our attendees today. When you talk about zero tolerance in the area of alcohol testing, what if somebody is way down there at 0.01 or, they're under 0.02, for example? The attendee wanted to know, how do you handle that in terms of what to do with that individual?
Well, that's when you decide on what you're... Right. If you have a zero tolerance, like you emphasized, you should always specify what you're testing for and what's going to qualify as a positive test result. So you can specify what level of alcohol is going to result in a positive test. And by when I say zero tolerance, what I mean is if they fail the drug test at the cutoff standards that you've set, then you have zero tolerance and they're immediately terminated. So that's within discretion under your policy and your applicable state laws as to where that cutoff point is going to be.
Okay, perfect. Here's a question that I'll take a first stab at. It's a two-part question. Do we have any statistical information on oral fluid testing in Canada and which provinces allow drug testing in Canada? As some of you on the line may know, there was a major Supreme Court case in Canada that was just recently decided in which it looks on the surface that it completely prohibits any kind of random alcohol testing. But the case itself didn't technically deal with drug testing. However, in Canada, the situation is very different. So to answer the question on a state-by-state basis in the U.S., we can go straight to that state's drug testing statute, case law, et cetera, and be able to answer the question. In Canada, on a provincial basis, province by province, it typically falls under the national labor agreements that have been reached in the country of Canada, which are typically not very favorable toward drug testing. However, that is not to say that you can't do drug testing in Canada. You can. and under some circumstances you can still do random drug testing. But I don't have statistical information on oral fluid testing in Canada. I don't know, Pam or Sharon, do either one of you have anything on that?
No, I don't on that one.
Okay, but we can make some inquiries about it. So if you'll just send your question to me in a separate email, we'll look into it and see if we can find something on that. However, there is another question for Pam. I know I covered cheating on oral fluid tests during my part of the presentation. Have you had any people actually, any of your clients actually come to you and say, you know, we suspect somebody's been cheating on their oral fluid test, or is it as difficult as people say it is?
No, actually it's been great, because we've put this into place in some cases where people were having trouble with either dilutes. They suddenly had a whole bunch of their employees getting dilute results, and the oral fluids test got rid of that problem because they no longer had to worry about dilute results. So I think sometimes that's a way people are trying to cheat. Sometimes it's not, but sometimes it is. And so far, no, I haven't had anything. Because it's witnessed by a supervisor, because it's something people aren't used to doing, and because it's just so simple and right in front of them, you know, put this in your mouth for 5 minutes, there hasn't been, so far, any concerns about that at all.
Okay, perfect. Sharon, here's another one for you. This is a good one. How about somebody who tests positive and is terminated, and then after some period of time reapplies for a position with the company after and being able to show some evidence, apparently, of completing a treatment program? And how does the ADA factor in that, the person would like to know? The Americans with Disabilities Act.
Sure. Obviously, the ADA protects those who have a record of drug and alcohol disability, but they have to be recovered. So if you're a current user and abuser of drug and alcohol, you're not covered by the ADA. But if you're a recovered addict, then you are covered by the Americans with Disabilities Act. The way I would see it working with your pre-employment testing is that, like I said, that pre-employment testing is done after a specified amount of time. So you should never request that they show you anything about completing a treatment program or anything like that. It should be just treated as a brand new application after 60 or 90 days, where they apply, you send them to testing again, they pass the test, end of story. Then all you have is a previous failed drug test. So at that point, you knew they were using then, but you don't know if they're a casual user. You don't know if it was, you know, an addictive situation, treatment, anything like that. So I would say the less you find out about why they had a positive and now they're a negative, the better off you are, which is why I said your policy should probably be written to say that you can, you know, if you want to allow, people to reapply, they can automatically reapply after 90 days. And they're just considered like a brand new applicant, because you do want to avoid any of that regarded as disabled under the Americans with Disabilities Act or having a record of a disability.
Perfect. Well, we're getting some great questions, and we're almost out of time because I know Sharon has to run to a training session that she's doing. Let me ask this question, and I'll take a first stab at it. How long will it be till DOT approves oral fluid testing? And when they do, when SAMHSA approves oral fluid testing, will we still need third-party administrators? Well, two-part question. And I know what Pam's answer to that question is, and Sharon's also. My answer is going to be the same. But first, the timing-wise, that's still going to be a while before that happens. First, SAMHSA has to approve lab-based oral fluid testing regulations. It'll go through a public comment period, then they'll be finalized, and then DOT will look at it. And they've already said publicly that they will allow lab-based oral fluid testing, but then that begins another process. And so when SAMHSA adopts the final regulations is one issue, when DOT does is another issue, and that's somewhat down the line. I do want to say this about third-party administrators. I think they're a critical part of the drug testing industry. There are so many things that a TPA does for you besides, overseeing your collections, that even if you're using lab-based oral fluid testing and you're using trained employees to do the collection in the workplace, that would by no means eliminate the need for a third-party administrator. Now, let me say, in the interest of full disclosure, most of my clients are third-party administrators. I'm not just saying it because of that. I've been in the industry for 24 years, and TPAs play just a very, very important role. There are so many things that can come up in the course of a drug test, from notifying the individual that they need to report for a test all the way to the result, a challenge to the result, etc. And TPAs are providing services all along that stream of from the beginning to the end of a drug test that I think with lab-based oral fluid testing, the need for a TPA is just as strong as it ever has been. And I know Pam and Sharon would probably agree with that. Anything you want to add to that before we conclude?
This is Sharon, and I would absolutely agree with that, because in this day and age of all of the different regulations, TPAs just stay on top of things. So like you said, once SAMHSA approves it, DOT is going to have to go through their regulatory process. They're going to have to publish it in the federal regulations. We could be talking 6 months to a year before DOT actually acts on it. And third-party administrators are up on all of those different issues. And like I said, they can really be a fall guy for employers because these are difficult conversations to have. And so most TPAs have been through them and helped clients with them. And they really are the experts in the area. So, I can't say enough good things about, our personal experiences using TPAs and our clients who have used TPAs. So,
excellent, Sharon. Thank you. Well, that concludes the formal presentation for today's webinar. Again, I'd like to thank Orser Technologies and OcuScreen. Their contact information is on the screen in front of you now. And with that, I'm going to turn the microphone back over to Jessica for the conclusion.
Thank you to all of our presenters today. On behalf of Orser Technologies and OcuScreen, we hope you have found today's presentation informative and helpful. This presentation was recorded, and you will receive instructions informing you how to access the recording. Today's presentation is approved for 1 credit hour of continuing education for CSAPAs and CDAPAs from SAPAT. Please use this unique identifier 0185-1310-current, CURRENT, in association with that credit. Again, the unique identifier for the 1 credit of continuing education for CSAPAs, CDAPAs from SAPAT is 0185-1310-CURRENT. Thank you for your attendance today. This concludes today's webinar.